Imagine a world without trees, without rivers, without shade, just the vast stretch of sand and silence, a place where the horizon swallows everything, and survival becomes the only prayer that ever matters. This is where the idea of God was born. Not in lush forests, not in fertile valleys, but in deserts, among endless dunes, scorching heat, and the cold isolation of the night sky. The desert is not just a landscape, it's a state of mind. Its emptiness turns sacred, a mirror that reflects human fear back at itself. When people were surrounded by nothing but desolation, they began to fill that void with meaning. The first gods weren't born in abundance, they were born in scarcity. They were not born from life, but from the struggle to survive. In the desert, there's no comfort in nature. The sun burns, the wind erases, and the stars feel both infinite and indifferent. Every day threatens death by thirst, and every night invites the terror of loneliness. When you have nothing, you invent something. The desert gave birth to gods because it gave birth to desperation. Civilizations that thrived in fertile regions, like ancient India, China, or Greece, developed gods of variety and contradiction, gods of art, of pleasure, of beauty, of chaos. But in the desert, the gods became singular. There wasn't room for many. The landscape itself was too severe for a crowd of deities. It was an environment that demanded simplicity. One God, one truth, one ruler, one way to survive. Monotheism is not a miracle of faith. It is a product of the sand. Think about it. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the three great monotheistic religions, all come from the same dry strip of earth, the same sun, the same sand, the same scarcity. Their God is the same voice echoing from the same wilderness. The geography shaped the theology. The physical desert became a spiritual metaphor, a place where obedience replaces understanding, where faith becomes the currency of endurance. In a world where nature gives nothing freely, control becomes survival. And so, the God of the desert became a God of control. His laws are not gentle suggestions, they are commands. They are absolute, unyielding, and unquestionable. Because in the desert, questioning can get you killed. You don't argue with the sun, you obey it or die. The psychology of survival became the psychology of submission. The commandments, the rituals, the fear, all reflections of that ancient landscape. The desert punishes independence. It rewards obedience. That's why the gods born there became jealous gods. They could not tolerate rivals, just as a desert can't tolerate abundance. Every drop of water matters, every grain of food, every act of loyalty. In that environment, devotion isn't love, it's dependency. Now, picture the human beings who first shaped these myths. Nomads, travelers, shepherds, people who had no permanent home. To them, movement was survival. The desert doesn't allow comfort or stability. Everything you own must fit on your back. The gods they imagined reflected that same instability. Their god, too, was a wanderer, appearing in burning bushes, in storms, on mountaintops. Never fixed, never certain, always just beyond reach. A moving mirage, a divine shadow projected onto the sand. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If God created the world, why did he choose the most lifeless part of it to reveal himself? Why the desert, not the forest, not the sea, not the mountain valleys where life flourishes? The answer lies not in divinity, but in human psychology. The desert amplifies fear, and fear is the birthplace of faith. When you live surrounded by death, you start needing reasons to believe you're being watched over. The emptier the land, the fuller the imagination becomes. Ancient people in the desert saw the sky not as a scientific wonder, but as a mystery filled with judgment. Every lightning bolt, every sandstorm, every drought, it all had to mean something. And when meaning didn't exist, they invented it. They created a being who could explain everything they couldn't control. God was not born out of wisdom, but out of the inability to accept chaos. Even the moral character of this desert god reflects the land he came from. He is unforgiving, jealous, quick to anger. He demands worship, not dialogue. His world is divided into believers and non-believers, just as the desert divides life and death with brutal clarity. There are no shades, no middle grounds, no fertile compromises. Everything is black or white, sacred or sinful, saved or damned. The desert leaves no room for complexity, and neither does its God. This simplicity, while powerful, became dangerous when exported beyond the sand. When a desert-born ideology reaches lush lands, it starts to suffocate diversity. The god of scarcity begins to rule over abundance, demanding the same obedience from people who no longer live on the edge of survival. The desert god thrives on control, and control becomes his mission even when the environment no longer requires it. Consider this. In places like Mesopotamia or Egypt, where rivers flowed and crops grew, gods were often kind, playful, or even human-like. They reflected the abundance of their environment. But in the barren wastelands of Arabia and the Levant, God became the opposite. Distant, invisible, unapproachable. When nature gives nothing, your God becomes everything. When nature gives everything, your gods become reflections of life itself. Geography is theology. The desert also created a particular kind of truth. Absolute, unquestionable, divine truth. In such a harsh environment, people couldn't afford moral gray zones. They needed certainty. They needed the illusion that someone, somewhere, was in control. So they built a God who never doubted, never changed, never evolved. The irony is that this rigidity, born of survival, later became the tool of domination. Once that kind of faith left the desert, it became the architecture of empires, crusades, and holy wars. The people who worshipped this god built stories that mirrored their own struggle. The exile from Eden, the wandering in the wilderness, the thirst for salvation, all metaphors for life in the desert. The promise of paradise, gardens, rivers, eternal shade, wasn't an abstract reward. It was the ultimate fantasy of people who lived their lives surrounded by death and sand. Heaven was simply the opposite of everything they knew. Their idea of bliss was born from the absence of it. If God had been born in a forest, perhaps heaven would have been an endless canopy of trees. If God had been born near the sea, paradise might have been waves and open horizons. But because God was born in the desert, heaven became an oasis: water, shade, fruit. The imagination of suffering created the image of salvation. Even the rituals of these religions reflect desert life. Daily prayers scheduled by the movement of the sun, fasting in times of heat, covering the body against the elements, pilgrimages across barren land. The entire religious structure is environmental memory, an echo of survival disguised as devotion. People continue these rituals thousands of years later, long after leaving the desert, never realizing that they are reenacting the fears of those who came before them. The desert also created a particular kind of authority. In a place where resources are scarce, hierarchy becomes essential. Someone must lead, others must follow. The same logic was applied to the heavens: a single ruler above and unquestioning followers below. Monarchy on earth mirrored monarchy in heaven. The social structure and the divine structure became indistinguishable. Religion didn't just reflect nature, it institutionalized it. When you strip away the poetry, you see the pattern. The desert shaped not only belief, but power itself. The same landscape that punished doubt also punished disobedience. And so, God's wrath became the ultimate political tool: obey or burn, believe or perish. What began as a way to cope with the environment became a way to control humanity. In the desert, truth was never about exploration. It was about preservation. You didn't question the water source. You protected it. You didn't debate the leader. You followed him. And so, questioning God became the same as threatening the tribe. Doubt was rebellion, and rebellion was death. The desert taught obedience, and religion sanctified it. But what's most fascinating is that the desert's silence was mistaken for divinity. The absence of sound became the voice of God. The emptiness became presence. The stillness became proof. The psychological need to fill silence with meaning made people believe they were hearing something sacred when, in fact, they were only hearing themselves. The mind echoes loudly when the world goes quiet. When people prayed in the desert, their words vanished into the wind. And because nothing answered, they imagined the answer. Over time, the silence itself became holy. God was not seen or heard, because he was never there to begin with. The desert made absence look like mystery. It made nothingness look like divinity. And that nothingness became the foundation of faith. From that silent emptiness came commandments, prophets, wars, and promises. Entire civilizations built around a voice that spoke from the void. The desert didn't just give birth to God. It gave birth to the illusion that silence is wisdom, that emptiness is depth, that fear is faith. But this is only the beginning of the story, the origin, not the consequence. Because once the desert's God left the sand, he didn't disappear. He evolved, expanded, and spread across continents. He began to rule over forests, cities, and oceans he never came from. And with him came the same desert laws, the same thirst for obedience, the same fear of freedom. When the desert's God began his migration into the wider world, he carried with him the psychology of survival. His laws, born in scarcity, were now imposed on abundance. He was no longer a god of tribes wandering through emptiness. He became a god of empires ruling over cities. Yet his commandments still smelled of sand and fear. The people who brought him out of the desert believed they were spreading truth. In reality, they were exporting anxiety. They brought the logic of drought into lands of rivers. They brought the morality of desperation into places of plenty. The God who